July 4, 1817. Daybreak. Cannons roared as a crowd gathered near Rome, New York, to witness the beginning of America's most ambitious construction project to date. The honor of shoveling the first spadeful of dirt for the Erie Canal went to Judge John Richardson.
By this great highway, unborn millions will easily transport their surplus productions to the shores of the Atlantic, procure their supplies, and hold a useful and profitable intercourse with all the marine nations of the world.
After that first symbolic spade plunged into the ground, members of the crowd, along with the hired workers, eagerly followed suit. The nation's first major public works project was underway. The goal was to create a 363-mile-long artificial waterway. It would connect the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie in Buffalo by following the contours of the Mohawk River Valley.
The Erie Canal was the child of Governor DeWitt Clinton. He saw that New York had a unique geographical feature, which was a gap in the Appalachian Mountains, which otherwise run uninterrupted from New Hampshire to Georgia. But at Albany, there is a gap. And so you could put a canal through there, run it to the Great Lakes, and thus trade with the trans-Appalachian part of the country, which is a very large, rapidly growing part of the country at the time.
Another very important factor was New York City. Merchants in New York City are looking for access to the West. They know if they can have access to the West, that they'll be the #1 port of entry for goods coming into the United States, as well as being the #1 commercial depot for grains and other goods being produced by the farm economy of the Midwest coming to New York.
And DeWitt Clinton just became determined to do it. And he tried to get the federal government to fund it. The federal government turned it down. Jefferson thought it was an absolutely lunatic idea. But Clinton got it through the New York State legislature. He was a masterful politician.
Clinton's tireless support of the canal would prompt his critics to call the endeavor Clinton's Big Ditch. Despite their sneers, popular support for the project grew each year. By 1823, the eastern end at Albany was completed. In honor of the occasion, a resident of Brockport, New York, offered a toast.
To our internal navigation, pork and flour coming down, tea and sugar coming up. Things are as they should be, some up, some down.
In 1823, another milestone was achieved when the western end at Buffalo was finished. But the midsection still needed to be completed.
They were grave doubts about the engineering capabilities of the day. Most of the engineers who worked on it were actually quite amateur engineers by the standards of our day. Most of them were prominent gentlemen in New York who had some experience surveying and some experience in engineering, but no formal education in engineering itself.
The Erie Canal had to overcome a 573-foot differential in elevation from beginning to end point. Ultimately, 83 locks were required to raise and lower boats along the way.
It certainly strikes the beholder with astonishment to perceive what vast difficulties can be overcome by the pygmy arms of little mortal man, aided by science and dictated by superior skill.
The canal engineers did a great deal of improvising as they went along. In addition to their ingenuity, the project required the brute strength and endurance of nearly 9,000 laborers who felled trees, hauled boulders, rechanneled streams, and shoveled tons of dirt.
The Erie Canal was the last major public work to be built almost entirely by hand. It was built by thousands of workers using pick and shovel, and they simply dug it. And they blasted out rocks and stuff like that, but otherwise it was done entirely by hand. Many of them by immigrant labor, and many of them Irish.
I think being here is better than staying in Ireland, landless and powerless, without food or clothing.
Most canal laborers lived in dismal circumstances and were paid under $1 a day. Their meager salary was augmented by an allotment of whiskey and food.
There's so many Irish keep coming every day, and they work so cheap, it makes it bad for laboring people.
In 1825, after 8 years of effort, the canal was finally completed all the way from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. That year, over 40,000 passengers traveled upon it. The barges only traveled at 5 miles per hour, but they still cut the travel time between Albany and Buffalo in half. There were no luxury accommodations on the overcrowded, mosquito-infested barges. Passengers had to fling themselves on deck each time they passed under a bridge to avoid decapitation. But during the next few decades, millions traveled the Erie Canal for business and pleasure, and it revolutionized the movement of goods, bringing wheat, pork, cattle, and whiskey to the east, and sending textiles, household goods, books, guns, and people to the west.
Previously, Western farmers had had to ship their goods either down the Mississippi and then through New Orleans and then around Florida, or up the Great Lakes to Montreal and the St. Lawrence and to the Atlantic. Before the Erie Canal, it would have cost about $120 to ship a barrel of flour from Buffalo to New York City. After the Erie Canal, it cost about $6 and took about, 1/3 the time.
New York City was by far the biggest winner of the Erie Canal. It got a head start in capturing the trade of the Midwest. And because people were shipping grains and other goods to New York City became a natural place in order to manufacture goods as well.
As Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet and the Supreme Court Justice, said that the Erie Canal in New York City had become that tongue that is licking up the cream of commerce of a continent.